And joining me now on set is CNET senior producer Dan Patterson, and in Syracuse, New York, we have Jennifer Greigel, a social media expert and assistant professor of communications at Syracuse University. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Welcome. Jennifer, I'm going to start with you. Conservatives accuse Google, which has 90% market share of web searches, of political bias. Is there any evidence of that?
Well, I think it would be really incredibly difficult to prove political bias at this point, especially since we don't have much insight into the algorithm. I think one of the more important statements was made when we referenced Tim Berners-Lee, who was one of the early founders of the World Wide Web, in his calls to re-decentralize the web. I think we need to be paying more attention to the market share and how big players like Facebook and Google are kind of squeezing out our ability to use a free internet.
Right. So you think some of this noise about political bias is deflecting attention from where it should be, which is just the fact of market share. Yeah, I think ideally every politician in government around the world is trying to figure out how to exploit a Google and a Facebook either through search or political ads. And again, for me, it really comes down to re-decentralizing the web so that there are more players in the market, more diversity, and less kind of control by these mega companies at this point globally. I think you make a very good point. Now, I want to play some sound from the hearing asking Pichai about Google's data collection. Let's listen.
Mr. Pichai, is it true that the Android operating system sends Google information every few minutes detailing the exact location of a smartphone within a few feet, the speed of movement of the phone, the altitude of the phone sufficient to determine what floor of a building the phone is on, the temperature surrounding the phone, and other readings? And if so, with Americans carrying their phones with them virtually at all times, doesn't the collection of this volume of detailed information really mean that Google is compiling information about virtually every movement an individual with a smartphone is making every hour of every day?
It depends on the applications users choose to use. If you're using a fitness application, which is detecting the number of steps you walk, you expect it to send that information. But it's a choice users make. We make it clear. And it depends on the use cases.
So the answer to my question, my first question, is yes. Is that correct, that the information that I cited is gathered by Google?
For Google services, you have a choice of what information is collected, and we make it transparent.
So, Dan, we just heard a stunning description of the amount of information that Google is capturing about us. And from your sources, you say that's just the tip of the iceberg. Is that correct?
Yeah, in fact, when we look at an Android device, this is Google's operating system that is on its own, it's sitting unused. That device, according to our sources, communicates with Google servers 340 times in a 24-hour period, up to 14 times per day, with the type of information that was explained during the hearing there. So again, I think Mr. Pichai is correct in that there is nuance if you choose to use an application that sends that type of data, including about where your phone is, the velocity, the temperature readings, that kind of thing. That would be dependent on an application. But that this is all going to and through Google servers and being harvested by Google is pretty surprising.
So is he not being entirely honest then when he says it depends on the apps that you use? Let's say you don't download any apps and you just have the very basic Google Chrome, service on your laptop. They're still able to collect an obscene amount of information about you. Yeah, at the very basic level. Correct?
I think the challenge with Google is that Mr. Pichai is probably being accurate, and I don't think he's being evasive. However, it really comes down to the nuance and how you define what types of data is harvested. Look, it is nearly impossible to escape Google capturing some parts of information about you, but the particulars all come down to how you use your device.
So, Jennifer, let's talk about that. How is all of this data that Google is collecting about all of us every minute of every day being used?
I mean, the bottom line for a lot of these social media companies is advertising, right? And the more specific data they can collect on us, the more targeted information and ads and effective ads they can send to us. So Their goal is to collect as much data as possible. We saw several references to a New York Times article which focuses on big players in that market, such as Foursquare. I don't think we've seen a lot of discussion around their capabilities, but they're really one of the best when it comes to location-based tracking, and they partner with a lot of apps in these big platforms as well. So again, they kept mentioning opt-in, opt-in, opt-in. 20 million, I think it was, visits to their kind of privacy page on the Google site. But I would rather know, like, how many times are users actually tweaking and changing their privacy settings? Just landing on a splash page is not really a signal. They could have clicked on it by accident.
Right. We definitely heard Pichai sort of emphasized, Dan, that the user's choice is involved here. And when asked about whether or not they were complying with all of the EU regulations, he said he was very familiar with them, which, as we know, are a lot more stringent than the regulations here in the U.S., which are almost non-existent. So, is Google complying to those very strict EU regulations, or are they simply paying the fines?
They're probably doing both. Look, Google takes regulation pretty seriously, but they don't like to take regulation seriously, and they are paying the fines. The challenge is that Google's technology isn't just advanced. It is so far advanced that it is difficult to regulate how we determine, like Jen said, what is opt-in, what is a choice, what defines how I use the service.
So you're describing a system that sounds to me so far advanced it's almost beyond the control of Google. It sounds as if they've almost created a monster.
Well, I don't know that Google would say they've created a monster.
Right, they definitely would not say that.
What they have created is a hyper-advanced analytics and advertising system. And this system is not, it doesn't run on its own, but there are so many different components of it. If we think of it like a spoke or a wheel and the spokes that come out of a wheel, it's just very difficult for one spoke to control what another one is doing, but they're both spinning.
Which gets back to Jen's earlier point about decentralization, that perhaps that could, answer some of these concerns that we all have. Again, Jennifer, I'm going to ask you about the sweeping new privacy laws that we saw enacted in Europe. Where do lawmakers here stand on similar legislation in the U.S.?
We, Senator Mark Warner has been trying to lead the charge, I think, but we're just not seeing that regulatory appetite here that we see overseas. I think it's because, again, these are U.S. companies. They don't want to see them leave this country. I think they could go do business anywhere at this point. So we really need our Congress to step up and to start to enact some laws. I think once there's some in place overseas and being put into place, we might have a little bit more leverage over here. But right now we're not seeing much beyond some basic tweaks to what they were calling Section 230.
Okay, one of the other significant things I thought to come out of this morning's hearing was that lawmakers asked about Google's plan to create a censored search engine for China. Take a listen.
We applauded you in 2010 when Google took a very powerful stand of principle and democratic values over profits and came out of China. I am concerned that you are now going back into China and upholding the dragonfly procedures which would help censor Chinese persons seeking a lifeline of democracy and freedom. How can you do that? And what are you doing to minimize or to indicate that this is not best practices?
Congressman, at the outset, right now we have no plans to launch in China. We don't have a search product there. Our core mission is to provide users access to information, and getting access to information is an important human right. So we are always compelled across the world to try hard to provide that information. But right now there are no plans to launch search in China.
So we heard the CEO of Google say there are no plans to launch a search engine in China. So what have we all been hearing?
Well, I think Google's own employees believe that there were plans, at least until very recently, to develop a search engine in China. Look, there's been very good reporting across the media and across tech blogs about Google's plans, and their own employees have had some real concerns about Google's plans in China, not just because of this potential search engine, but the precedent that could set for future endeavors. If you bend on one thing, say their employees, it's pretty easy to bend on others.
So was he giving an incomplete answer there, you think?
It would appear that way, but I want to talk to some people at Google and kind of get a sense of what Pichai was getting at here, because we did have quite a bit of evidence that Google was developing until very recently a search engine in China. So his answer was very surprising, and until I speak to some sources at the company, I'm not quite sure how to interpret that answer.
Right. So, Jen, the other thing I want to ask you is that he sort of would defend himself or the idea of a search engine in China before saying, no, we're not planning on one, by saying, you know, look, we have found in other countries that any sort of open search engine, even if perhaps it is somewhat censored, any sort of opening helps people in that country, give them information. Do you buy that argument?
Yeah, I think we have to be very clear. It's a human right to have access to, like, a free press, not just information. So if information is censored, that is not fulfilling that human right. We're starting to see restrictions, I think, and interference even here in the United States. I want to draw more attention to the rise of state-funded media here as well, under the Broadcasting Board of Governors, it was called. But we're starting to see the lack of the free press worldwide, not just in China, but the United States and around the world. So that's something else we need to be paying attention to.
Okay, so you're making the distinction between, journalism and information, which I think is a valid one. All right, Dan Patterson and Jennifer Greigel, thanks to both of you for being with us and sharing your expertise.